As you can see, the stress mode of coping is a way to deal with life, and it's rooted in our biology as animals who have become what we are over the course of millions of years of evolution. The stress response is highly embodied, and it is accomplished through highly refined bodily mechanisms. So I want to name two of these in particular, which are the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Let's unpack these for a moment. The autonomic nervous system is a major wing of the central nervous system, which also extends out into the peripheral nervous system. The autonomic wing of the nervous system is the part of the nervous system that primarily deals with changing conditions, and one of its elements is called the sympathetic nervous system. That's the part of the brain that handles fight or flight reactivity. So, for example, if something happens that seems stressful, parts of your brain, notably the amygdala and the hippocampus, inside the emotional limbic system in the center of your head, light up, and they send signals to the sympathetic nervous system to do things like make the heart beat faster, move blood to the muscles in the legs and the arms for fleeing or fighting, dilate the pupils to get more light so you can see more of what's going on around you, and so forth. Similarly, the amygdala sends a signal to a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is right next to the amygdala, which then signals the pituitary gland, which is nearby, to in turn release hormones into the bloodstream that tell the adrenal glands, which sit on top of each of your two kidneys, to send stress hormones like adrenaline or cortisol through the bloodstream. Those steps, by the way, in the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis seem complicated, but they actually occur within a second or two. So as a result, just as you know, when you're in a stressful situation, you can feel the changes in your body as adrenaline and cortisol move through your bloodstream. In effect, the stress response enabled by these two mechanisms of the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis shunt resources away from long-term projects for immediate emergencies. We evolved to handle brief bursts of acute stress. They usually get resolved quickly, one way or another, for better or worse. But we did not evolve to handle chronic, ongoing, mild to moderate stress, which is epidemic in modern life. In other words, chronic, ongoing, moderate stress is unnatural, and the results include major disturbances of physical and mental health. For example, chronic stress disturbs the major systems of your body. And let's go through 5 of these. For example, in terms of the gastrointestinal system, stress shuts down digestion. No point in digesting food when you're running from a tiger. And as a result, people experience, under chronic stress, digestive maladies that range from constipation and diarrhea all the way out to ulcers and malabsorption of the nutrients we really need. Similarly, chronic stress suppresses the immune system. No sense in dealing with major illnesses, again, when you're running from that tiger or racing to get to a work project out on time. So, for example, as stress goes up, the functioning of the immune system goes down, which is why we're much more vulnerable to colds and flus when we're under stressful conditions. Or people who are seriously ill do much better if they're not being simultaneously stressed. A third system that's impacted by chronic stress is the cardiovascular system. Stress, for example, as you may well know, is a major risk factor for heart attack. Or take the hormonal system, the endocrine system. Again, chronic stress suppresses reproductive hormones. No time for sex when you're running from that tiger. So libido drops, as well as other disturbances in the endocrine system that have to do with things like heightened PMS. And last, in the nervous system, chronic stress decreases serotonin, a very important neurotransmitter that's involved in regulating mood as well as sleep and digestion. And stress can create this nasty, vicious cycle inside your brain as well. And it works like this. Cortisol, a stress hormone, sensitizes and stimulates the amygdala, which is the alarm bell in the brain. So it gets ever more reactive to stress, stimulating more cortisol in a vicious cycle. And second, in a nasty 1-2 punch, chronic cortisol weakens the hippocampus, a part of the brain that forms memories for context and which also helps quiet the amygdala as well as cortisol release altogether. And in the extreme, chronic stress releases of cortisol can shrink the size of the hippocampus by up to 25%. The result then is, as I said, this 1-2 punch in which the alarm bell in the brain is getting louder and louder and louder, and the brakes on that alarm bell, in other words, the hippocampus, are getting weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker in a vicious cycle that then makes us ever more reactive to stress and therefore ever more stressed in terms of stress hormones, making us even more sensitized down the road. In addition to these physical effects, stress feels bad. It doesn't feel good to feel frazzled, rattled, pressed, under pressure, out of control, upset. Let's remember that feeling upset is a form of stress reactivity. And stress leads us to act badly toward others. We get more fearful, we get more irritable, we also get more cautious and less willing to take chances or invest in others. And because of these ways of acting toward other people, stress on us creates vicious cycles in which our stress spills over onto other people who get stressed and then act in ways that stress us further. So taking all of this into account, it's important to take up arms against stress. If a person has any interest at all in living well for a long period of time, stress really is the enemy. This means two fundamental things. First, protecting your brain from stress and from stress reactivity. And second, gradually training it to respond to changing events from a place of well-being instead of stress. To get into the details of how to do that now, let's consider how stress moves through the three fundamental motivational systems in your nervous system. And then we'll consider how each one of those systems is operating in a state of well-being rather than in a state of stress. As context, let's step back and consider the evolution of life on this planet. This planet's old, 4.5 or so billion years old, and yet life emerged fairly quickly in the history of this planet around 3.5 billion years ago. That's the earliest fossil record of the very first forms of life on this planet. Then, for nearly 3 billion years, life existed entirely in a microscopic form. Viruses, bacteria, single-celled creatures called protozoa, etc. Then, about 600 million years ago, those multi-celled creatures had gotten complicated enough that they needed a way to communicate between their sensory apparatuses and their motor systems. And that mode of communication was the beginnings of the nervous system. So your nervous system has been evolving now and developing and improving and refining itself for 600 million years. About 80 or 100 million years ago, the first mammals arose. Then came our primate ancestors, maybe about 60 million years ago, depending somewhat on how these classifications are developed. The first stone tool-making hominids, our very first ancestors who could make stone tools, lived about 2.5 million years ago. They had brains about a third our size. The brain has tripled in size over the last 2.5 million years, but they could still make stone tools. About 150,000 years ago, the first modern Homo sapiens arose. So if you look back on it, it's been a really long, strange trip, hasn't it? If you just think about it, there have been about 100,000 generations since the first hominids began making stone tools, and over that time, evolution has continued. It's even continued in the last 3, 4, 5,000 years. During this long run of evolution, our ancestors had to find ways of responding many times a day to opportunities and to threats. In other words, to carrots and sticks. Thus, they developed two fundamental systems inside the nervous system as a whole, particularly headquartered in the emerging brain. One system to approach opportunities and one system to avoid threats. In other words, one system to get carrots and one system to dodge sticks. Now, worms, houseflies, frogs, mosquitoes, fish, lizards, sharks, crocodiles, they all have these two systems. They approach rewards and they avoid threats. Then, in the last 80 to 100 million years or so, a great evolutionary breakthrough led to the development of a third system, affiliating with us. For example, birds and mammals have bigger brains in proportion to body weight than fish and reptiles do. What do birds and mammals do that fish and reptiles don't do? birds and mammals pair bond and they raise their young. To choose a good mate and to keep working things out with that mate, and then to raise young well and keep them alive to pass on their genes, you've got to be smarter. If you're a sparrow or a squirrel, you've got to have more on the ball than an iguana or a shark, who they have their young and wandered away and make wander back, might even eat them. Next stage of development of the affiliating system occurred in primates, who are highly social, and in direct proportion to the social complexity of a primate group, the size of the primate brain is literally larger. And then this affiliating system developed even further to an extraordinary degree in humans, who are the most affiliative, the most loving, the most social, relational animal on the planet. Human beings, like you, like me, who bond with our mates, form attachments between parents and children, develop friendships, clans, tribes, and nations.